The first time I heard the ground humming under my boots, I knew somebody was living off my land and praying I'd never notice. It was just before sunrise, that cold gray hour when the Texas air still carries the damp smell of cedar, mud, and last night's rain. I'd been on the farm for 9 days, long enough to learn where the fences sagged, where the north pasture dipped after a storm, and where the old barn settled with a groan when the wind came in from the east. But that morning, standing out near the far tree line with a mug of stale black coffee cooling in my hand, I felt something different. A vibration. Low. Steady. Mechanical. Not loud enough to hear from the house, but strong enough to rise through the soles of my work boots like a second pulse. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and 3 weeks earlier I had signed the papers on a 1,000-acre farm outside Burnett County because I wanted peace, distance, and enough sky over my head to remember what quiet was supposed to sound like. After 15 years of contract excavation, utility trenching, and fixing other people's bad decisions with a backhoe and a long day, I'd had enough of subdivisions, enough of cul-de-sacs, enough of polished men in tucked-in shirts telling me how land ought to behave. This place was supposed to be simple. A weathered farmhouse. A collapsed equipment shed. 2 stock tanks. Faded fence posts. A windmill that hadn't turned in years. And beyond my western boundary, pressed up against my property line like it had grown there by accident, a manicured HOA development with stone entry signs, matching mailboxes, and roofs so new they still reflected morning light like broken glass. The previous owner's paperwork had come in 3 banker boxes that smelled like mildew and old paper, and I hadn't gotten through half of it yet. I knew there was an old well house on the back section, and I knew the title mentioned water rights, easements, and a recorded utility corridor that hadn't made much sense to me at closing. But when you buy a place this big, some mysteries take time. I followed that hum through waist-high grass silvered with dew, past a rusted cattle gate and a line of live oaks, until I found the old pump structure half hidden behind mesquite. The concrete slab was cracked. The cinderblock walls were stained with age. But the lock on the steel access panel was new. Not old new. Not neglected new. Fresh. Bright metal. Recently cut and replaced. I set my coffee down on the slab and crouched beside the line coming out of the pump house. Big pipe. Pressurized. Not feeding a farmhouse. Not feeding cattle. Feeding volume. Serious volume. I put my palm against it and felt the water rushing through with the kind of force you don't mistake if you've spent your life around buried infrastructure. Then I looked past the cedar break toward the subdivision on the other side of my fence and saw the first sprinkler heads kick on in perfect rows, misting emerald lawns under a sunrise that hadn't fully broken yet. 1 yard. Then another. Then another. 50 houses, maybe more, all waking up green and glossy while my hand rested on the pipe carrying their morning across my land. The smell in that little pump house was iron, wet concrete, and hot motor oil. Somebody had been maintaining that system. Somebody had kept it quiet. Somebody had counted on the farm being empty, ignored, or owned by the kind of man who never asked questions. I stood there listening to the motor run and the water push hard through the line, and for the first time since closing day, I understood what I had really bought. Not just a farm. Not just 1,000 acres of dirt, cedar, and old fencing. I had bought the throat of the whole neighborhood next door, and they hadn't realized the water keeping their little paradise alive came from my land. I spent the next 2 hours doing what I have always done when something feels wrong. I stopped talking and started looking. The sun had climbed high enough to burn the dew off the pasture by the time I walked back to the house, swapped my coffee for a tape measure, a shovel, and the yellow legal pad I use when I do not trust my memory. The farmhouse kitchen still smelled like fresh paint over old pine and the cardboard dust from half-unpacked boxes. Every cabinet door stuck a little. Every floorboard answered with a creak. It was not pretty yet, but it was mine, and after years of motel rooms, rental houses, and job sites where everyone acted like land was just another line item, that mattered more than polished countertops ever could. I was 42 years old, divorced for almost 5, and tired in that deep way that sleep does not fix. I had spent most of my adult life moving dirt, laying utility trench, repairing drainage systems, and cleaning up after developers who built first and asked questions later. I know what buried pipe sounds like when pressure is good. I know what a legal easement usually looks like on paper versus what people pretend it means in real life. And I know this for sure. Nobody spends money keeping a hidden pump station running unless that water matters to somebody. By noon I had walked the line twice. The farm rolled wide and uneven, all limestone shelf, cedar breaks, an open pasture stitched together with old fencing and forgotten improvements. There was a dry creek bed cutting across the west side, a stand of pecans near the south tank, and just enough old infrastructure left behind to tell me the previous owners had once done more with this place than graze cattle. Concrete footings. Pipe markers. A capped lateral line near the east road. Things most people would miss because they were too busy seeing sunsets and acreage numbers. I saw systems. I saw intent. And the more I looked, the clearer it became that this farm had not been abandoned so much as quietly used by people who hoped no one would ask where their water really started. The subdivision next door looked different in daylight. Less charming. More arranged. The kind of neighborhood where the grass is clipped to the same height, the front porches are staged like model homes, and every driveway says somebody cares a little too much what the neighbors think. I could hear the high whine of distant pool pumps and catch the chemical smell of chlorine when the wind shifted west. Kids' bikes leaned against garage doors. Delivery vans rolled in and out past a stone monument sign with the HOA name carved into it in fancy serif letters. Everything over there looked permanent, expensive, and completely disconnected from the old farm beside it. That was probably the illusion they liked. Then I found the meter housing. It sat low near the back fence under a patch of scrub oak, half covered in dirt and grass clippings like somebody had tried to make it disappear without actually removing it. The lid was heavy cast iron, warm from the sun. When I pried it open, the hinge gave with a metallic groan, and there it was. A commercial flow meter, not ancient, not decorative, still active. The dial was turning. Slow and steady. Recording every gallon being pulled through my side of the line. I stared at those numbers longer than I want to admit, because numbers make things real in a way suspicion never can. Water was moving. A lot of it. Enough to irrigate common areas, feed retention ponds, maybe even backstop household supply during dry months. I wrote everything down. Meter model. Serial number. Direction of flow. Approximate line diameter. Then I went back to the house and opened the first banker box on the dining room table. The paperwork inside smelled like dust, mildew, and old ink. Deeds. Tax records. Survey maps. A brittle manila folder labeled utilities. I ran my thumb along the edge of a folded plat map and felt that old familiar tightening in my chest, the one that comes right before a job stops being simple. Out on the other side of my fence, the neighborhood shimmered in the heat like it had every right to be there. But inside that quiet farmhouse, with sunlight hitting old county records and a legal pad filling up in my handwriting, I was starting to understand something they clearly had not. They thought the farm was scenery. Background. A patch of land too old and too far gone to matter. What they did not know yet was that I had built my whole life on finding the one buried detail everyone else was counting on me to miss. The first person from the HOA came over the next afternoon, right around the time the heat started lifting the smell of sunbaked cedar off the fence line and turning the air thick enough to taste. I was standing on the porch with a folder of county records in one hand and a tape-stained plat map in the other when I saw the white SUV rolling slow down the private road that ran along my eastern boundary. Clean paint. Chrome trim. Tinted windows. The kind of vehicle that never hauled feed, never crossed a muddy pasture, never spent a day doing anything harder than looking expensive. It stopped at my gate without honking. That told me plenty already. Whoever was inside expected the world to open for them. The driver's door swung wide, and out stepped a woman in a pale blue blouse, pressed white slacks, and sunglasses large enough to reflect half the sky. She moved like she owned every square foot she could see, including the parts with my name on the deed. Margaret Whitmore. I knew it before she even introduced herself. Some people carry authority the way other people carry perfume. Loud, expensive, and impossible to ignore. Up close, she looked to be in her early 50s, polished in that real estate brochure kind of way, with a careful smile and the sort of posture that said she had not heard the word no often enough to respect it. Even from 30 feet away I could catch the sweet artificial scent of something floral floating ahead of her in the heat. She paused at the closed gate, one hand resting lightly on the top rail like it was an inconvenience instead of a boundary. "You must be Mr. Caldwell," she called out, voice bright and practiced, every syllable smooth enough to sound friendly if you were not listening carefully. I walked down the porch steps slow, boots scraping dry dirt, records tucked under my arm. "That depends who is asking." Her smile widened, but only at the corners. "Margaret Whitmore, president of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association next door. I thought I would come welcome you to the area before rumors got ahead of introductions." That word landed exactly how she wanted it to. Rumors. Meaning she already knew I had started looking. Maybe somebody had seen me at the pump house. Maybe one of her landscapers noticed me opening the meter box. Maybe she just had the kind of instincts people develop when they have been getting away with something for a long time. I stopped on my side of the gate and let the silence sit there a second. Wind pushed through the grass. Somewhere off in the distance, I could hear a mower droning inside the subdivision. "That is thoughtful of you," I said. Not many neighbors show up carrying warnings with their welcome. Her sunglasses tipped down just enough for me to see the eyes behind them. "Cool. Measuring." "Oh, I am sure this is all just a misunderstanding," she said. The previous owner had a very cooperative relationship with the community. Shared resources. Access arrangements. Practical matters. We all like to keep things running smoothly out here. Shared resources. Access arrangements. Practical matters. That was how people like Margaret dressed up dependents when they did not want to call it what it was. I shifted the folder under my arm and watched her glance toward the far side of the property, west toward the old pump structure hidden behind cedar and mesquite. Tiny movement. Fast. But I caught it. "Funny," I said. "I have been going through the paperwork and I have not found much that looks shared." She laughed softly, the kind of laugh meant to lower the temperature in the room without surrendering an inch of control. County records can be messy. There are old agreements, utility understandings, legacy easements. The sort of things that do not always make sense to a new owner right away. There it was. The first push. Gentle. Patronizing. Built to sound helpful while telling me to stay in my lane. The heat shimmered above the road between us. Dust clung to the hem of her white slacks where she had stepped too close to the shoulder, and I remember noticing that because details matter when a person is trying very hard not to show you their real face. "I understand old systems just fine," I said. "I have spent most of my life working around buried utilities." Her smile thinned by half an inch. "Not enough for anyone else to notice." "Enough for me." "Then I am sure you also understand how disruptive it can be when someone starts making assumptions before speaking to the right people." She said right people the way some folks say law or church, like the phrase should settle the matter on its own. I looked past her toward the subdivision, toward the neat rooftops and decorative stone and green strips of grass being kept alive by water moving under my soil. Then I looked back at her hand still resting on my gate. "I was actually planning to speak to the county," I said. "Seems like the right place to start." For the first time, the smile left her eyes completely. The breeze shifted again, carrying chlorine, fresh mulch, and cut grass from her side of the fence. Suburban comfort. Manufactured order. A whole little kingdom drinking through lines she was hoping I would treat like background scenery. Margaret lifted her hand off the gate and straightened like she had just made a note to herself. "I am sure we can avoid unnecessary complications," she said. "Willow Ridge values good relationships with neighboring landowners." I nodded once. Then that should be easy. Good relationships usually begin with honesty. She held my stare for a beat too long, then put the sunglasses back in place and turned toward her SUV with that same polished control. No slammed door. No raised voice. Just quiet irritation wrapped in expensive manners. But as she drove off down the boundary road, one thing had become perfectly clear. Margaret Whitmore had not come to welcome me. She had come to see how much I knew, and when she left, I had my answer. Enough to make her nervous. Margaret did not wait long to make her next move. 2 mornings later I was at the dining room table with survey maps spread beside a plate of cold toast, the ceiling fan pushing around the smell of dust, coffee, and old paper when I heard tires on gravel and the hollow metallic rattle of my front gate. Not one vehicle. 3. I stepped out onto the porch and saw a white pickup with a magnetic door sign for landscape maintenance, a dark grey utility cart with orange safety flags, and Margaret's same polished SUV idling behind them like she was overseeing a project already approved by heaven and county law. The men in the truck climbed out carrying clipboards and measuring wheels. One of them had bolt cutters hanging from a tool belt, which told me everything I needed to know about how this visit was supposed to go. Margaret stepped out last, sunglasses on, phone in hand, moving with that same calm certainty people wear when they think paperwork has already defeated you. The morning sun was sharp enough to make the hood of her SUV throw white light across the yard. Cicadas had started up in the trees, and the air carried that dry mineral smell you get before a real Texas afternoon settles in. Mr. Caldwell, she called, smiling like we were meeting for brunch instead of a boundary dispute. I thought it would be helpful to clear up some confusion. These gentlemen are here to inspect the access corridor and utility easement so we can maintain continuity of service. She said continuity of service like it was sacred scripture. I walked down the porch steps slow, legal folder under one arm, and stopped well short of the yard. You are not coming onto my property. One of the contractors looked at Margaret instead of me. That was interesting. Not a utility district crew. Not county. Just hired help waiting for a queen's permission. Margaret gave a tiny shrug, all polished concern. This is routine. The community has relied on that infrastructure for years. I am trying to avoid unnecessary drama. Then she nodded toward the man with the measuring wheel, and he took 2 steps toward my gate. Stop right there, I said. My voice carried harder than I expected, flat and clean in the morning air. He froze. The cicadas seemed louder all at once. Margaret took off her sunglasses and looked at me like I had embarrassed her in church. Mr. Caldwell, if you interfere with established utility access, you could expose yourself to significant liability. Liability. There it was again. The favorite perfume of people who build their confidence out of threats they hope you never verify. I pulled a folded survey copy from the folder and held it up just enough for her to see the county stamp. This boundary was recorded before your subdivision existed. If you have a valid easement, you can send me the instrument number and the scope of access in writing. Until then, nobody touches a lock, a panel, a line, or a gate on my land. The man with the bolt cutters actually shifted them behind his leg when I said it. Tiny movement. Guilty movement. Margaret saw me notice. Her jaw tightened for half a second, then she smoothed it back into that real estate smile. You are making this more difficult than it needs to be. No, I said. I am making it documented. That landed. I could see it in the way her shoulders went still. People like Margaret thrive in the grey. Verbal understandings. Friendly assumptions. Old habits dressed up as law. The moment you put a timestamp on things, the game changes. She looked past me toward the house, probably clocking the security camera mounted under the eave, the one I had installed on day 3 when I realized this place came with more history than the seller disclosed. Then her gaze slid back to the folder in my hand. County records. Survey copy. Notes. She knew I was not guessing anymore. The contractor with the measuring wheel cleared his throat and asked quietly, "Do you want us to wait?" He said it softly, but on an open farm with no traffic and no wind, every word carried. Margaret smiled without looking at him. Yes, she said. For now. Then she put the sunglasses back on and stepped closer to the gate, not enough to cross it, just enough to let me hear the edge in her voice under all that Polish. You should understand something, Mr. Caldwell. There are families over there. Children. Elderly residents. People who depend on services staying uninterrupted. If your actions create hardship, the community will remember who caused it. That one was crafted carefully. Not a direct threat. Something worse. Public blame. Social pressure. The old suburban trick of turning dependence into moral leverage. I could smell fresh-cut grass drifting from the HOA side, sweet and green and expensive, fed by the very line she was pretending not to be worried about. Then the community should ask why their board never bothered to confirm where their water rights actually begin, I said. For the first time, her expression slipped in full daylight. Not anger. Not fear exactly. More like the flash of a person watching a door close that they had always assumed would stay open. She recovered fast, of course. People like Margaret always do. She turned, said something clipped to the contractors, and headed back to her SUV. Without another word. The truck backed out first. The utility cart followed. Her vehicle rolled away last, slow enough to feel deliberate, dust lifting behind the tires in soft brown waves. I stood there until the sound of engines faded and the morning went quiet again except for insects and the distant hum of pumps still running on the west line. Then I looked at the gate latch, the fresh scrape marks near the chain, and the boot prints pressed into the dirt on my side of the fence. She had not come to inspect anything. She had come to test how easy I would be to move. And when she left empty-handed, I knew the next move would not be polite. The letter arrived by certified mail on a Thursday afternoon, tucked between a farm supply catalogue and a property tax notice, with my name printed in a legal font that already smelled like trouble before I even opened it. The envelope was thick, expensive, and unnecessary, the kind of paper people use when they want intimidation to arrive before the message does. I stood in the kitchen with the screen door propped open, hot wind pushing in the smell of dry grass and distant rain that would probably never make it this far, and read every line twice. Willow Ridge Homeowners Association formally notified me that any interference, obstruction, delay, or disruption involving shared community utility infrastructure could subject me to civil action, emergency injunctive relief, recovery of damages, and legal fees. Shared community utility infrastructure. There it was again. Their favorite phrase. Neat. Vague. Built to sound official while saying absolutely nothing that could survive real scrutiny. What caught my eye was what the letter did not include. No recorded easement number. No deed reference. No county filing. No legal description of the corridor. Just pressure wrapped in polished language and signed by an attorney whose office was 2 towns over and probably billed by the quarter hour for every use of the word continuity. I laid the letter flat on the dining room table beside the plat map and stared at the ink while the old ceiling fan clicked overhead. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown local number. I answered, and the first thing I heard was sprinkler spray and voices in the background, like whoever was calling me was standing outside near a common area. Mr. Caldwell, a man asked, smooth voice, young, trying for professional but landing somewhere near rehearsed. This is Daniel Mercer with Mercer and Pike, counsel for Willow Ridge. I wanted to reach out before this gets more complicated than it needs to be. That phrase again. More complicated than it needs to be. Everyone on their side talked like I was the one inventing the problem instead of discovering it. I walked out onto the porch and looked toward the subdivision beyond the pasture fence, where rooftops sat bright under the sun and ornamental trees lined streets that had probably been named after birds or wildflowers no one there could identify. Complicated usually means documented, I said. So go ahead. He gave a short laugh like we were both reasonable men trapped in an unfortunate misunderstanding. Our client's position is that the community has long-standing reliance interests and historical access rights related to the water service corridor crossing your parcel. We would strongly advise against taking any unilateral action while the parties review the underlying record. I leaned against the porch post and watched a hawk circle over the south field. Then send me the underlying record. Silence. Not long, but long enough. In construction, in courtrooms, in county offices, silence tells the truth before people do. He cleared his throat. That is being assembled. That means you do not have it. His voice tightened by a degree. It means these matters can take time. Funny, I said. Your threat letter did not seem to need much time. The wind shifted, and I caught the smell of wet irrigation and chlorine from Willow Ridge again, that clean suburban scent made possible by infrastructure no one wanted to admit ran through my farm. Daniel tried once more, softer this time, almost sympathetic. Mr. Caldwell, there are families involved here. We are asking for cooperation while the legal status is clarified. Families. Always families. As if families somehow convert private dependency into public ownership. I am not the one who built a neighborhood around a water source without making sure the paperwork was real, I said. Clarify all you want. Until then, nobody enters my property without permission. He did not like that. I could hear it in the way his next words came slower, colder. I would encourage you to consider how this may be perceived if service interruptions occur. There it was. Not law. Optics. Blame. The old game. Paint the man asking questions as the villain before the truth has time to put on its boots. Then I would encourage your client to stop implying I owe the neighborhood free access to anything, I said, and ended the call before he could dress another threat in polite language. By evening the pressure had moved online. I do not spend much time on neighborhood apps, but one of the feed store guys in town had a sister in Willow Ridge and forwarded me screenshots. Residents were posting about a hostile adjacent landowner. A newcomer threatening vital infrastructure. Concerns about water security. One woman wrote that selfish rural property owners should not be allowed to endanger children just because they wanted to play cowboy. That one made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so transparent. Margaret had not found her paperwork, so she went looking for something easier to control. Narrative. I sat on the porch as the sun dropped behind the cedar brake, the board still warm under my boots, and listened to the distant hum of the pump carry through the evening air. Crickets starting up. Cattle lowing from a ranch half a mile over. Wind brushing the dry grass in long soft waves. They were trying to make me feel isolated before I had even made a move. Trying to turn me into a public problem so they would not have to answer a private one. But that is the thing about men like me. I have spent too many years under open sky, fixing systems other people pretended were fine, to be scared off by a strongly worded letter and a whisper campaign behind decorative stone walls. If Margaret wanted this to become a matter of public perception, that was fine by me. I was already knee-deep in the kind of facts that do not care how pretty the neighborhood newsletter looks. The breakthrough came the way most real ones do, not with a courtroom speech or some dramatic confession, but with dust on my hands and a county clerk who sounded bored enough to tell the truth. The following Monday I drove into Burnett just after 8, my truck still carrying the smell of diesel, old coffee, and sun-warmed leather from the long ride in. The courthouse sat there in the square like it had seen every bad decision in the county and survived all of them without moving an inch. Inside, the air conditioning had that overworked government building chill, and the records office smelled like toner, old paper, and laminated maps. I spent 3 hours pulling plats, transfer documents, archived utility filings, and subdivision approval packets old enough to remember when Willow Ridge had still been pasture. At first it was the usual mess. Revised boundaries. Supplemental drainage notes. Utility sketches with handwritten initials in the margins. The kind of paper trail developers create when they are moving too fast and assuming they can clean up the details later. Then I found the subdivision packet. Not the glossy sales version. The real one. The planning submission. Stapled exhibits. Infrastructure phasing. Preliminary water source identification. That was where the whole thing cracked open. Willow Ridge had originally proposed a municipal tie-in from the county water district. The application included projected demand, line maps, and engineering cost estimates. The district denied full service capacity for the first 2 construction phases because the area could not support the projected draw without upgrades. I read that line 3 times. Denied full service capacity. Which meant the neighborhood, in its current form, should never have been able to rely on county supply the way it clearly was. Not legally. Not fully. Not at build-out. A woman at the back desk named Donna, who had the calm voice of someone who had spent 20 years surrounded by paperwork and fools, noticed me cross-checking the utility sheets against a later plat. She walked over, glasses low on her nose, and asked what I was hunting. I told her I was tracing an old water corridor tied to my parcel. She looked at the subdivision name, looked at me, and gave the kind of half-smile county employees reserve for people who have finally asked the right question. You need the temporary service rider, she said. Most folks stop at the development plat and never go to the attachments. That sentence was worth more than some men's law degrees. She helped me pull a supplementary binder from archived planning files, and there it was. A temporary private supply arrangement executed during early development, allowing limited non-permanent water access across the parent tract until alternate infrastructure was constructed or municipal expansion was approved. Limited. Non-permanent. Temporary. 3 words that hit harder than any threat letter Margaret had sent me. The rider referenced a prior landowner by name, granted access only for interim service to common area irrigation and initial occupancy support, and tied continuation to future district expansion and separate negotiated renewal. There was no automatic perpetual easement. No blanket right for a full subdivision to drink forever just because someone once worked out a stopgap deal. Better than that, the rider had a sunset trigger. Service rights expired upon transfer of the parent tract unless expressly renewed in writing by the new owner. I sat there with that paper in my hands and felt the whole shape of the thing settle into focus. Willow Ridge had not built its future on solid entitlement. It had built it on an old temporary arrangement that should have ended the day I bought the farm. All those green lawns. Those stone entrance signs. Those polished newsletters and threat letters and public posts about selfish landowners. They were all standing on a legal extension cord run through my property by people who bet no one would ever unplug it. But the best part was still waiting in the next file. The planning correspondence showed internal county concern from years back that the HOA had marketed later phases as having stable water service even though long-term supply remained contingent. Contingent. That word sat there like a loaded nail in dry timber. There. Board had not just relied on my land. They had planned around it. Budgeted around it. Sold homes around it. Somewhere along the way, Margaret and everyone before her had stopped treating the water crossing my farm as temporary and started treating it like destiny. I left the courthouse with copies in a manila envelope thick enough to bend, and by the time I stepped back into the Texas heat, the square smelled like truck exhaust, hot brick, and barbecue smoke from somewhere down the block. The sun hit hard off the windshield as I set the document on the passenger seat and just sat there for a minute, listening to the truck tick in the heat. I had come in looking for proof of access. What I found was something much better. Proof that the entire neighborhood next door had been built around a promise that was never theirs to keep, and that Margaret Whitmore had been threatening me over a water arrangement that legally should have died the moment my signature hit the closing papers. Once I had the documents, I stopped reacting and started building the board the way I do on any job where one bad assumption can cost a fortune. I did not call Margaret. I did not answer the next unknown number that hit my phone. I did not post, argue, explain, or threaten. I drove back to the farm with the courthouse copies on the passenger seat and the late afternoon sun turning the windshield into a sheet of white heat, and by the time I reached the cattle guard at my front entrance, I had already decided the next move would be quiet, legal, and impossible for them to spin. The farm felt different that evening. Same pasture. Same cedar breaks. Same old house settling in the heat. But now every line and structure had context. The pump house was no longer a mystery. The meter box was no longer a suspicion. The old utility rider in my folder had turned the whole place into a map of leverage. I parked by the barn, grabbed a tape, a camera, and the county plat copies, then spent the next 4 hours walking every inch between the recorded boundary and the active water corridor. The grass brushed against my jeans in dry whispers. Crickets started up under the fence rows. Somewhere down by the south tank, frogs were making enough noise to sound like rusted hinges in the dark. I photographed everything. The access path worn into my side of the property. Tire impressions near the pump slab. The newer lock. The fresh scrape marks by the panel. The commercial flow meter still turning under its iron lid. I measured offsets from the fence, marked landmarks, flagged line direction, and wrote down every detail while there was still enough light to read my own handwriting. Facts first. Feelings later. That has saved me more than once. The next morning I called a surveyor out of Marble Falls, a hard-faced man named Wes Harper who spoke in short sentences and carried himself like somebody who trusted steel pins and field notes more than conversation. By noon he was on my west line with a tripod, orange paint, and a stack of coordinate sheets, confirming what I already knew but needed on paper from somebody no one could accuse of guessing. The corridor crossed my land. The pump structure sat on my land. The meter sat on my land. And there was no recorded perpetual easement burdening the parcel in the current chain. Hearing another man say it out loud, standing there in the smell of hot brush and diesel exhaust, hit different. It made the truth feel less like discovery and more like a countdown. From there, I started closing doors one by one. I had a local attorney send a formal demand for documentary proof of any claimed access rights within 5 business days. I had him include notice that unauthorized entry onto the parcel would be treated as trespass and that no maintenance, inspection, or alteration of any water infrastructure on my land was permitted without my written consent. Clean language. No drama. No bluff. Then I called a security company in town and had 2 trail cameras and 1 gate-facing camera installed before sunset. I even put up fresh signage at the east access route, white background, red block letters, private property, no unauthorized utility access, all the kind of simple visible warning that looks boring right up until it starts appearing in evidence packets. What I did not do was touch the water. That part mattered. Margaret was waiting for me to panic, overreach, and hand her a story about some angry country landowner punishing families. I was not going to give her that. Let the pumps run. Let the lawn stay green. Let the board keep smiling through their newsletter posts and legal threats. Pressure works best when the other side cannot hear it building. By Friday evening I had a survey affidavit on file, camera footage active, notice delivered, and a folder thick enough to make any honest county official stop and read twice. I sat on the porch that night with a glass of iced tea, sweating rings onto the armrest, and the wind carried that same faint blend of cut grass, chlorine, and pump heat from the subdivision next door. They still thought this was about controlling a resource. It was bigger than that now. This was about timing. About putting every piece in place so that when Margaret finally made her next move, she would not be stepping onto open ground. She would be stepping exactly where I needed her to. Margaret made her move on a Tuesday night under chandelier light and polished fake concern, in a clubhouse that smelled like lemon cleaner, brewed coffee, and the kind of expensive air freshener meant to suggest order even when the room is full of panic. One of the Willow Ridge residents had slipped my attorney the meeting agenda that afternoon. Community water security. Legal response strategy. Adjacent landowner dispute. They were not trying to solve anything. They were trying to stage the story before the facts arrived. So I put on a clean pearl snap shirt, carried a hard copy folder thick enough to leave a dent in a folding table, and drove over just before 7 while the last of the heat still rose off the blacktop in visible waves. The parking lot was packed with polished trucks, luxury sport utility vehicles, and golf carts lined up like a suburban parade. Inside, every chair was full. Men in pressed polos. Women with highlighted hair and worried eyes. Board members at the front with bottled water, printed agendas, and expressions that tried very hard to look calm. Margaret stood behind a small podium under the Willow Ridge crest, all light blue blazer, perfect posture. And soft outrage. She was in her element. I stayed in the back near the coffee station long enough to hear her open with the word community 4 times in under 2 minutes. Community concern. Community stability. Community continuity. Community threat. Then she brought my name into it, careful and clean, painting me as an unpredictable outsider creating uncertainty around essential services. She never said water rights because she knew better. She said legacy access. She said historical use. She said neighborly cooperation. Every lie was dressed in a cardigan. Then she noticed me. It happened in a blink. Her eyes found the folder in my hand, and the color changed in her face by half a shade. Not enough for the room. Enough for me. Mr. Caldwell, she said, smile tightening around the edges. I was not aware you would be joining us. I kept my voice even. Seems fair to hear what is being said about my land in person. A few heads turned. Someone near the front shifted in their chair. Margaret gave a small gracious nod like she was welcoming open dialogue, but I could see the tension in her fingers where they rested on the podium. Of course, she said. We all want a respectful conversation. Respectful. That word always shows up right before dishonest people lose control of the room. She kept going for another minute, talking about legal review and interim protections, until my attorney, who had arrived separately and knew exactly when to move, stood from the second row and asked whether the board intended to disclose the temporary private supply rider from the original planning file. The room went still in that special way public rooms do when truth enters before people are ready. Margaret blinked once. I am not sure what document you are referring to, she said. That was the moment she lost. Not because everyone understood the law. Most of them did not. She lost because too many people in that room understood what lying sounds like when it is caught off guard. My attorney handed copies down the row. Then I stepped forward and laid out the survey, the county attachments, the temporary rider, the sunset trigger, the denial of full municipal capacity for early phases, and the surveyor affidavit confirming the pump structure, meter, and corridor all sat on my property. Paper on table. Map on table. County stamp on table. No yelling. No theatrics. Just evidence spreading across polished laminate under fluorescent light while the room filled with the dry rustle of residents picking up copies and realizing their board had built years of certainty on paperwork that expired the day I closed on the farm. Someone in the back asked the question every board fears. Wait. Are you saying the HOA never owned the water access? Another voice followed before Margaret could answer. Then why were we told it was secured? The smell of coffee and copier toner felt suddenly sharper in the room, like even the air had turned honest. Margaret tried to regain control, talking about ongoing interpretations and good faith reliance, but it was over. Good faith reliance does not survive a sunset clause and a survey map with your neighbor's property line highlighted in yellow. I stood there while her residents looked from the documents to the board table and back again, and for the first time since I bought the farm, the hum I had been hearing was not coming from a buried pump. It was coming from a room full of people realizing the woman who had threatened me, lied to them, and tried to turn me into a villain had built her little kingdom on a line that ran straight through my land. By the next Friday, Willow Ridge had a new attorney, a county mediator on the calendar, and a board so shaken it could not even agree on the wording of its own emergency update. Margaret did not send me another warning after that clubhouse meeting. She sent silence, which in my experience is what arrogance turns into when it finally meets a document it cannot charm, threaten, or out-talk. The farm was quiet that week in a way I had not felt since closing day. Mornings came in slow over the pasture, pale gold spreading across the grass while the pump still ran under the west line, steady and mechanical, the same low hum moving through the ground beneath my boots. But now every sound carried a different weight. The system was still working, still feeding the lawns. The fountains, the retention pond by the front monument sign, maybe even backup domestic storage for all I knew, but the illusion had changed. Before, that water moved like a secret. Now it moved like leverage. My attorney and I met the HOA and their new counsel in a county conference room that smelled like burnt coffee, copier heat, and old laminate. No chandeliers this time. No polished speeches. Just binders, legal pads, and one county official with a tired face who had clearly seen too many people confuse convenience with ownership. Margaret was there in a cream blazer, posture straight, mouth set in that careful line people wear when they are trying not to look as cornered as they feel. She did not look at me when the meeting started. She looked at the papers. Smartest thing she had done since I bought the farm. Their lawyer tried one last soft approach, talking about continuity, good faith reliance, and the hardship sudden changes could create for residents. My attorney responded with the survey affidavit, the expired rider, the transfer trigger clause, the unrecorded nature of the claimed long-term access, and the documented unauthorized entry attempts after I took title. Then the county mediator asked the only question that mattered. Does the association have any current recorded instrument granting perpetual access or water rights across Mr. Caldwell's parcel? The room sat still long enough for me to hear the air conditioner kick on. No, their attorney said at last. Just that. One word. Clean. Heavy. Final. From there it moved fast. They wanted time. They wanted continued service. They wanted to avoid litigation, avoid disclosure issues with homeowners, avoid the kind of county scrutiny that starts with one expired agreement and ends with 10 other problems coming to light. What they got was a temporary access license drafted on my terms. 90 days. Metered use. Paid maintenance escrow. Indemnity language. Strict entry notice requirements. No trespass beyond the marked corridor. No representation to residents that the supply was owned or guaranteed by the HOA. And the part that made Margaret's jaw tighten so hard I could see it from across the table, they would fund design and construction planning for an independent long-term water solution at their expense, because the line under my land was no longer treated like inheritance. It was treated like what it had always been. Mine. I did not shut the water off. I did not have to. That is what made it beautiful. They came in ready to paint me as reckless, and I gave them structure, conditions, invoices, and signatures instead. The kind of justice that does not shout. The kind that files clean and holds up under fluorescent light. A month later the first payment cleared. 2 months after that, county-approved engineers were back out at Willow Ridge studying alternatives they should have planned years earlier. Margaret resigned before Christmas. Officially for personal reasons.